For over a decade, Western academia has pushed the open science movement. The goal is simple: maximize transparency by treating research data as a shared public good. Institutions rely on the FAIR principles to ensure every dataset is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But the assumption that all data belongs to the public domain ignores a long history of what is known as helicopter research in Indigenous communities. Researchers arriving briefly, extracting data about a community's lands, cultures, or genetics, and leaving to publish their findings elsewhere. The community rarely saw the raw data, let alone any tangible benefit from the resulting publications. Treating Indigenous data as a neutral resource to be freely shared through the FAIR principles ignores the existing power imbalance. It turns identities and sovereign knowledge into resources for others to exploit. On the left, the machine-centric FAIR framework. On the right, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance's CARE principles focus on people. Notice the pulsing nodes for authority to control and ethics. They ensure data use aligns with Indigenous ethical standards, generating collective community benefit. Ethical research now requires transferring the power of data governments back to the communities the data actually describes. It requires moving away from the assumption of open access and toward a model of strict sovereign consent. In Canada, the premier ethical and technical standard for First Nations data is stewarded by the First Nations Information Governance Centre. Their framework ensures that abstract suggestions about sovereignty are translated into enforceable standards. This structure outlines the 4 pillars of OCAP: ownership, control, access, and possession. Together, they establish that First Nations have the absolute right to manage and collectively own information about themselves, right down to the methodology of the research. While ownership is the principle that a community legally owns their information, possession is the concrete physical control of that data. If research data sits on a university server, it is automatically subject to institutional policies and federal laws, like the Access to Information Act. An external party could legally request that data, potentially overriding the First Nations' assertion of ownership. Physical possession prevents this. It provides the mechanism to protect community interests. Under OCAP, the Western researcher must accept a new reality. They do not own the knowledge they collect. They are temporary service providers operating strictly under the mandate of the nation. A common error in academic grant proposals is the assumption that OCAP is a universal pan-Indigenous framework. Treating it as a catch-all can lead to a proposal being rejected for failing to understand the specific rights of the community involved. The First Nations Information Governance Centre is explicit. OCAP is a registered trademark, and it applies strictly to First Nations. Canada requires a distinctions-based approach that separates the governance needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This graphic shows the distinct architecture of Indigenous data governance in Canada. For research involving Inuit communities, the authoritative framework is the National Inuit Strategy on Research, or NISR. It focuses heavily on regional control across the 4 Inuit regions and Inuit-led determination over data collection. Métis communities utilize their own framework, the OCAS principles. Notice the top of the 3rd pillar. The S stands for stewardship. Unlike OCAP's strict requirement for physical possession, stewardship reflects a specific Métis context focused on safeguarding collective resources and data for future generations. Forcing a single Western data model, or assuming one Indigenous framework applies to all, erases distinct legal and political identities. A true nation-to-nation relationship begins with the exact framework mandated by the community you are working with. These frameworks are no longer optional ethical guidelines. In 2021, the Canadian federal granting agencies, CIHR, NSERC, and SSRC, rolled out the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy. For researchers seeking federal funding, this policy mandates that any data management plan involving Indigenous research must be co-developed with the community. The community decides how the data will be managed, and those terms must be explicitly detailed in the grant application. The policy also contains a critical exception. While federal agencies normally require research data to be deposited into a digital repository for public reuse, Indigenous data is exempt. If the community determines their data should remain closed to the public, the federal agencies support that decision. When researchers submit their applications, they must provide clear evidence of free, prior, and informed consent. They have to prove their data strategy aligns directly with the specific CARE, OCAP, NISR, or OCAS principles relevant to the project. Institutional control is taking a backseat. Relinquishing authority over data to Indigenous communities is now a requirement for securing Canadian scientific funding. This creates a logistical challenge for the university researcher. How do you satisfy the technical requirements of an institutional data deposit while ensuring a First Nation retains total control and physical possession of their files? This schematic illustrates a solution known as mediated access, utilized by Canadian platforms like Borealis. The metadata describing the project remains public, making it findable. However, the actual data files are locked. Anyone requesting access must submit their purpose to a designated community steward, who evaluates the request based entirely on community protocols. Contrast this with national platforms like the Federated Research Data Repository. Their current systems cannot restrict data access long-term. Any data deposited there will eventually become public, a direct violation of the OCAP principle of access. To formalize a mediated access workflow, researchers must sign a legally binding data sharing agreement. This document explicitly identifies the community as the sole legal owner of the data and defines the university researcher simply as a temporary steward. True stewardship means letting go of the colonial instinct to extract information. It requires building reciprocal trust. Before you draft your next research proposal, your very first step should be taking the official OCAP training provided by the FNIGC. Learn the standards, respect the distinctions, and center community authority.